Those memos essentially, while could not begin to heal the frustration and the pain and the trauma that you've heard today by some of the members today, and I appreciated the last testifier in the sense that I fully acknowledge that the frustrations and the challenges extended through into the families, not just the service member themselves. Throughout the COVID-19 vaccination conversation, Nebraska was intentional in our decisions to be as amenable as possible to religious and medical accommodations while adhering to federal guidance as directed by the Department of Defense. And as Senator Brewer pointed out, while we are a Title 32 force during the preponderance of our service under the command and control, or under my command, but under the control of the governor, but federally funded, we are still subject to the same entry standards and qualifying conditions to continue to serve in the military services established by the Secretaries of the Services and the Congress of the United States. Under then Governor Ricketts' leadership, a shared understanding was established that no Nebraska National Guard member would be separated for vaccination refusal under any status besides honorable, or general under honorable if there were other conditions. This agreement was then carried over with the new administration, Governor Pillen's team, and fortunately has not been applicable to any of our members. The Nebraska National Guard has not discharged anyone related to vaccination refusal. There have been, however, and I acknowledge some of the previous testifiers, some who elected to separate at the end of their enlistment, contract or retire rather than accept the vaccine. As you heard Major Cassidy talk about, he elected to resign rather than continue his service. I think we've done a relatively good job of trying to navigate the federal oversight on this issue, in a way that allowed members to make choices all along the way. But the reality is we were subject to those federal guidelines, and we couldn't ignore them. And in fact, the Oklahoma lawsuit was actually dismissed because the courts tend to show a great deal of deference to the services in terms of training and conditions for service. However, the courts did acknowledge that in the case of the request for religious accommodation, that the process was flawed and implied an injunction to prevent anybody from being discharged because it was not clear that due process was allowed to proceed in terms of those accommodations, and those were halted. So the courts have had various opinions on this. I thank Senator Brewer and the committee for their consideration of the well-being of our National Guard members. I and my office will continue to comply and adhere to federally mandated guidance on this topic, but we are also committed to sharing relevant information when applicable. And perhaps for consideration, the language of this bill could be a legislative resolution conveying the intent of the body, because we're still subject to the federal guidelines. Thank you, and I'm available to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, General Bohac, for your testimony. Any questions, General?
I'm a general. Thank you, General, for coming. So, did any servicemen or women, did they opt for the honorable discharge through this period of time?
So
was that a choice for them?
So the characterization of discharge is not a service member's choice. It's based on the character of their service. So at the time they're discharged, separated, or retired, then we characterize their service. But anyone that's, unless there are other issues with their conduct, right, they've been discharged under honorable status.
So help me understand. So you're discharged basically when your term of service is up.
That's correct. An enlisted member signs an enlistment contract for a period of, usually initial period of 6 to 8 years, and can extend those contracts in various lengths. At the end of each of those contracts, at the end of that term of service, they have an option to sign up, or we also have the option not to allow them to renew. But in those cases where they elect to separate, those have typically been honorable separations.
Can you tell me, has there been other situations or circumstances where people have been granted a religious exemption for taking other vaccines? I think one service member You said MMR, I assume that meant measles,
Mumps,
mumps, and
rubella.
rubella. Okay, yeah, all right.
Prior to this, quite frankly, Senator, I'm not aware of religious accommodation for vaccinations that any have been granted or requested. I am aware of at least one service member who had a qualifying medical condition that exempted them from vaccinations and continues to serve today.
So are, the National, is the National Guard members, are they required to get the flu vaccine?
They are.
They are.
It's an annual seasonal flu vaccine that's structured for each, flu season, attempted to keep structured. They are required to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any other questions? Senator Halloran.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sanders. Welcome, General Bohac here. It's an awkward situation that a lot of people will put in, not only the enlistees, but those overseeing them. Can't reverse some of that, but just to ask a question, in 2020, when the pandemic was first announced, what was the assigned strength of the Nebraska National Guard, Army and Air?
You're gonna push my memory a little bit here, but I could probably give you percentages more accurately, because that's what I track. So out of approximately 3,400 Army National Guard authorizations in the state, we were at about 93% filled. And in the Air National Guard, with about 1,000 airmen, at that time, we would have been about 102%.
Okay, thank you. Where are we now?
Today in the Nebraska Army National Guard, we're at 90.8% filled. And in the Air National Guard, this is artificially displayed because we gained some new authorizations in the state that we're filling now, but we're at 96% filled.
So there's been a drop.
Yes, sir, there has been, and I would offer that it's not just the vaccination, it's all the implementation. However, and this is a different question in the sense that access to schools, et cetera, which is a prime recruiting source, high schools for us, during the particularly 2020-21 was difficult because it broke our relationships with our recruiters for not having contact with students. So that was a consequence.
So recruitment's more of a challenge than ever.
Particularly for the Army National Guard, actually for the United States Army across the nation. It's not only Nebraska, it's across the nation.
Senator Halloran, any other? Senator Lowe.
Thank you, General Bohac. Appreciate the service. How many do you estimate that may have not re-enlisted because of the COVID vaccine? Has there been a number that is kind of higher than normal of those not re-enlisted?
Well, I can tell you this, Senator, that in the Army National Guard in June of 2022, when the deadline approached for either being vaccinated or request exemption, either religious or medical, we had 109 refusers in the Nebraska Army National Guard. 34 of those, a handful of those elected to become vaccinated, and now with the elimination of the mandate, another 29 have returned to service, and we're actively recruiting those folks back in that, because of federal policy, could not attend drills or training and be paid. So we're actively recruiting them back in. We won't get them all back. I mean, just to acknowledge Major Cassidy's point earlier, he feels like his faith with the services has been broken clearly, and there will be those that won't return for those purposes. I think it's a little harder for us to determine how many elected to separate at their end of service or retire in lieu of getting the vaccine, but we know we've had some of those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Halloran.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sanders. That raises a question. Are there exit interviews?
We do exit interviews. I don't know that we usually ask, why are you separating, or and Senator, my experience has been we get mixed results with the exit interviews. people are always not willing to say their actual reasons and offer to say it's my time to leave. So I don't have good data to answer that question.
I appreciate that. So how do we make this up, or is it a federal issue? How do we make this up for lost promotions,
Yeah.
lost income?
Well, part of it is going to be my direction and the ongoing direction to the force, which is we will accommodate people back into qualifying schools as quickly as possible and move them along. But there is, as previously noted, there is the issue of lost time, which we can't replace. There's nothing I can do with that. But what I can try to do is to help people get back on, as far along back on track as we can. There's been the conversation, at least in some circles, about financial compensation. The Department of Defense has signaled fairly strongly that they will not be considering that for back pay, if you didn't show up for work, we're not gonna pay you for not showing up for work. But what we can do within the rule sets, and there are some limitations, but we can offer people the opportunity to come in and perform additional drill to make up some of that time. But when we start crossing fiscal years, it becomes more difficult because the money doesn't follow from year to year. It expires.
Senator Hall?
I know when we're trying to recruit people in from other states, we try to look for those well-qualified people to come in. And I would think those that have left would probably be the most qualified to come back in.
Yes, sir.
And I think extra effort ought to be given to hiring those, bring those men and women back to work again. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'm very willing to do that.
Okay. So how far short are you, from meeting recruiting goals at this time?
Well, I can tell you that last year from the period of 1 October to 30 September of '22, we met 50% of our recruiting target, which is unprecedented. We were looking to recruit 400 folks into the Army National Guard, and we did 200.
If you don't follow the federal guidelines, do you lose federal funding?
We do. We can't. We're at risk for that.
But if you didn't, you might not have lost it.
I can't answer that question, Senator, because that's, it's a hypothetical, and it's what I will tell you that in any National Guard state, right, 95% of our funding comes from the federal government. That produces all the equipment, the pay, et cetera, that funds our Nebraska National Guard. The legislature and the governor appropriates approximately $7 million a year to support the Nebraska National Guard. So it's about 5 to 4% of our total budget. Willfully disregarding federal policy and rules would put that funding at risk, and could lead, theoretically, to withdrawal of federal funding for our units.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hall. Senator Ringwald?
Are you able to get back into the high schools now to help recruit?
We are improving our access and getting back into, we generally, by the way, we generally have very good relationships with the schools in the state of Nebraska in terms of access. And when we do have some resistance, usually a visit by myself or other senior leaders to discuss the challenges and the approaches solves the problem.
Okay, great, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator.